This is Talking Foreign Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad, and I'm Eve Engler. Today, we're going to be talking about Trump's tariffs, his threats, Canada's role in advancing the US empire as much as any country. Yet, still, we're in a situation where the US is turning on Canada. Yet the ruling class's response has been to give it even more, to talk about more money on the military that's very much aligned with the US, more anti-China, more sort of border security, do whatever we can to placate Donald Trump. To discuss this Canada's reaction to Trump, what Trump's done, we have Sam Gindin, who's former economist with the Canadian Auto Workers and the co-author of the book, The Making of Global Capitalism, The Political Economy of American Empire. First of all, thanks a lot for coming on Talking Foreign Policy. And Sam, can you give us your sort of reaction to Trump's threats, the tariffs, what you think he wants, just a sort of general overview of your reaction?
Well, a couple of things. It's not very clear what he actually wants. I mean, the Wall Street Journal, in an editorial, called it the dumbest trade war in history. Um, because it's not just about tariffs. Partly, it's about using tariffs uh, as a bargaining chip to get other things. Part of it is, some Trump keeps repeating, for example, that he sees the tariffs as a way of raising revenue. And that sounds like a freebie. We're going to get all this revenue by imposing it on Canada. In reality, what he wants to do with that revenue is pay for the tax cuts to the super rich. And because he knows that if he just gives them tax cuts, he's going to have a deficit problem. And so this is one way of offsetting it. He's got some silly arguments about fentanyl and Canada at the border, which people have looked at it, it wouldn't make more than a difference of 1% in what's happening. But the main point is America's got the worst record in the world on drugs, and it's been going on for a long time. And it's an internal problem that they have to address. So it's just another way of him deflecting these failures in the United States. It's not clear to me what's going on, but I would say something else about it, which I think is important. There's going to be pushback because this isn't actually in the interest of American capital. And when the pushback comes, the question is, how will Trump react? Right now, he's reacting because he's the king. He's got absolute power. But the pushback, business in the States has basically been thinking that, well, he's going to give us tax breaks and deregulation. So let's go along with it. But if he starts playing around with the empire in terms of the economics of the empire, we'll stop him. I think that's what they're basically thinking, because they're not interested in China retaliating and cutting off American access to China. They're not interested in ending and disrupting the supply chains that are coming in from everywhere. Canada's surplus with the United States is, if you subtract the energy part of the surplus that America really desperately wants, Canada has a deficit with the United States. Canada ranks, way down the list. I think it's about 4% of America's deficit. So there's no rationale here, and that's going to be exposed. And when it gets exposed, the question is whether he will say, drop the tariffs and say, look, they were just a bargaining chip and I got what he wanted. I don't know. I mean, I think we really should have to wait. The most important question for us is not to get hung up on just the question of tariffs and how to retaliate and how politicians can posture. And then when the tariffs end, see, we saved Canada and we go back to a status quo. That's the real problem. The real problem is that Canada is so dependent on the US and so integrated that uh, this is what happens. America can do these things, and then there's kind of a show of fighting back. When what really has to happen is we have to start delinking from the United States in all kinds of ways. And if you're going to delink, you also have to raise the question of not just nationalism, but why are we delinking? you have to talk about some vision that is different from both the United States and from what Canada has been in the last period. And that's what we have to get on the agenda. We have to use this moment when people are saying, what the hell is going on, to frame it differently so that Canadians really are thinking about, do we want to challenge American foreign policy? Do we want to challenge NATO? Do we actually want to increase our military expenditures like the US is insisting on? Do we want to supply the American military with their energy needs? Uh, and do we instead want to start thinking about diversifying, about restructuring our own economy, having a different international vision? Those are the big questions that have to get on the agenda.
I agree. Chantal Hébert in in a thing I saw of her earlier today, a well-known CBC commentator, Toronto Star columnist. She says that this speech that Trudeau gave on Saturday night to the sort of response to Trump, that this is first time in Canadian history where they sort of targeted a U.S. president in this way. She says that other instances, it's never 2003, Chrétien, when he officially didn't join the Iraq War, he didn't actually sort of announce it publicly. So she was framing this as kind of unique and a little bit about it, a little bit sort of suggesting, we've done that to the Chinese president, to Modi in India, but never to our closest ally. Now, in that speech, Trudeau also said, so while in one sense sort of challenging the US, he also said that from the beaches of Normandy to the mountains of the Korean Peninsula, from the fields of Flanders to the streets of Kandahar, Afghanistan, we have fought and died alongside you during your darkest hours. So he obviously also made this big sop to the U.S. Military machine and Canada's contribution to the U.S. military machine. Um, yeah, so what's your kind of thoughts on that? On one hand, sort of challenging the U.S., and another hand, reinforcing the U.S. empire.
Yeah, I think the key question is there's going to be a lot of posturing around this question. I mean, this is, it's so gross and insulting that I think politicians are recognizing they have to respond, and in fact that they can respond in a way that has them leading a nationalist fight, which they've never taken on before. I mean, in Trudeau's case, is also his weakness as the head of the Liberal Party right now, which has him looking for something that restores some confidence in his leadership. I guess I see it as uh, fighting with the Americans over a tariff thing and saying we're going to hit you harder. We're going to also retaliate. We have to do. You can't just lie down. But we're not going to win a war that's only about tariffs. The Americans, when you're fighting the most dominant economy in the world and you're so integrated with it, you're not going to win by saying, well, we'll threaten you on the same terrain. You have to make the terrain bigger. And one of the things you have to do, and it's good that Trudeau is doing this, is to say, look, the message to the world, which is already questioning American credibility internationally, is that if we can do this to an ally and somebody who's been our most dependent ally and our main economic partner, what does this mean in the rest of the world? And I think that's where the America is vulnerable. I think it's the right thing to threaten them with. We're not going to win the small war, but we can raise something that might have a dynamic to it. So that is there. The problem with it is that if you really challenge America and you don't just kind of get rid of the tariff and say, see, we saved Canada, we're now back to the status quo of supporting America in all these ventures. If that's all you do, yeah, you're just, what's the word for it? You're co-opting, the sentiments that are emerging out of America's action. What you would really have to do if you were serious is to say delinking is actually going to be difficult. You can't be so dependent and think that you can snap your fingers and change things. And delinking is the issue. We've learned a lesson from the future. As long as we remain so integrated and dependent on the US, next time Trump may just phone the Prime Minister of Canada and whisper in his ear, we need you to do this. And you'll do it because you don't have a choice. You won't be, as grandiose about it as and transparent as Trump is. So I'm just worried that we not get into the trap of thinking that if we make some loud statements and the Americans give in or there's a new deal, that the problem is over. We have to challenge our politicians to say this actually means some serious delinking. It needs some serious thinking about our relationships to America in terms of its imperial ambitions and role, and to the environment, and to the structure of our economy. These are big questions that involve a lot of risks, and that's what we have to address. And I'm afraid that what we're seeing is something that's performative. Talk big and send a message that and I think also, I should say, I think that Trudeau is also reading, I think accurately, that American business isn't going to like this. American business doesn't want this disruption. They want to go on with the world as is. They just wanted some goodies, and they're going to be nervous about this. So I think he's reading it right about that. He's also kind of speaking for Canadian business. The people who will be the most against us if we actually start delinking, the first line of attack won't come from America. It'll be from Canadian business, who is going to freak and panic. I actually thought they would wait a while to see how this plays out, but they actually seem to be getting nervous about it, as you said in your article. And they're getting panicky that this could get out of hand. So they're trying to also kind of preempt it. So, yeah, I think that we can use what Trudeau said because it opens some avenues and it gives some legitimacy to criticizing the America, which is very important. But we shouldn't think that Trudeau is declaring a turn in Canadian history. Now, that's going overboard.
Yeah, like my impression is that there's a big chunk of the ruling class that is just they're happy for Trump kind of attacks at the so long as it sticks to the level of just pressuring Canada to increase military spending, for instance, right? There's all kinds
Yeah.
of Conrad Black's talking about we have to get to 3% of GDP.
Yeah.
And he's sort of, happy. I think they would be happy if the result of this battle was to, in a month from now, Trump withdraws the tariffs and Canada commits to 2% of GDP and then a plan for 3% or
Yeah.
whatever. Now you suggest that this is obviously to really respond, it requires something from below, real, delinking, some serious social movement organizing. Um, I do think, like, while in one sense the left is in a very weak spot, on foreign policy specifically, or let's call it, an anti-imperialist struggle, if you want to use that word, it has actually been quite a major movement over the past 16 months. There is the biggest popular revolt against Canada's complicity in an international crime, I think, ever on against Canada's support for Israel's genocide in Gaza. So there is this sort of activism. Lots of young people who've been really sort of radicalized, politicized, have the skills, have the time, are angry. Um, and so I think in one sense, there is ability to sort of merge some of those forces with a kind of broader and in a sense deeper political sentiment of against, okay, the Americans are attacking us and yeah, this big bad ugly American imperialism kind of stuff. There is the ability to sort of merge that. Now, one of the groups that would be kind of at the forefront of merging some that could be at the forefront would be the Council of Canadians. I think if there's any vehicle in this country that could sort of bring that together, it would be the Council. Unfortunately, they have been pretty much absent on the opposition to genocide, but they have this history, which you would know going back to the fight against free trade 40 years ago. They have this history of sort of challenging corporate globalization, challenging, I guess, the ugly American, if you like. They've put out, with Charlie Angus, they put out something called the Pledge for Canada. Is sort of one of their reactions. I think really kind of the only formal leftish reaction. I mean, obviously some unions have put out statements and other individuals and groups, but trying to bring together somewhat of a coalition, it seems like. What's your sort of reaction to this pledge for Canada? And I guess maybe some of that bigger question of that, the organizing and some of these forces.
Yeah. So, excellent question. So, let me just go back to your point about business. I think, if all that happened was the Americans threatened, and then the next day Canada did some of the things that the conservative business wants, that would be, they'd love it. They're worried that this can get out of hand. This is territory, as they were worried with the free trade agreement. I mean, they, in the middle of that free trade agreement, took up in the mid 80s, took up front page ads saying we absolutely support Canadian social programs. And it's only if we link with the United States and grow fast that we can afford them. So, yeah, so business is going to panic that this can get out of hand and will quickly start jumping in and making the arguments about why we have to get a deal, kind of a thing. Uh, but really, I don't think business really needed this. They're doing fine in terms of Canada following the United States. That extra business about, increase expenditures from 2 to 3% is not, that can happen without this kind of a trade war. So business, that's business. Business is not going to be an ally. I think it's critical to note that anybody who talks about nationalism, it's not about an alliance with business against America. This is going to have to be, if we're going to talk about restructuring our economy, it's not going to come from an alliance with business who does not want to do this. It's going to be a more radical step that's going to have to require more government regulation and public ownership in sections, etc. So that's just one thing I just want to make clear. That's not who part of the alliance is. On the other hand, what you're saying about the alliances, it raises very important tactical questions. So I think you're absolutely right about the Palestinian movement. There's a lot of potential there. I don't know how, you know, I don't want to exaggerate it, but I see it as an incredible opportunity. I mean, I see this as a long-term process. I don't see this as we're going to, develop a movement and then win in a few months. Uh, I see this as a long-term process, and the people who got active around Palestine uh, are really positioned to become part of this process. In other words, for them themselves to say we have to think beyond Palestine and be part of a larger movement that includes Palestine and win people to that. So I think that's a very important base. Uh, the unions, in the States, I think the unions are really confused about what this means, and they think that Trump is supporting them. But in Canada, it's the opposite. Canadians are looking and they're saying, what the hell, unions are saying, what the hell's going on? But I think it has to be framed for them. So the unions don't just respond to this in terms of, oh, this is bad because it's hurting us, and we want to make sure the United States lets us have access to American markets and go back to the status quo. I mean, I think there's a challenge with the unions to say, look, you've got to think larger than your own interests. You actually have to think of some class interests here and where this is going in the long term. Like in the auto industry, you're vulnerable whether there's tariffs or not. Tar Trump is basically announcing that I can do whatever I want. And that means some businesses are going to say, we better not invest in Canada, no matter if there's tariffs or not. And the trade union movement has to really think about what this means and, rethink about its long defeats and where this is going and what it would mean to challenge those defeats. Something like the Council of Canadians, I would welcome, obviously them being involved in this and saying good social democratic things that even the NDP isn't saying. I think that's fine. The problem with it is that it's too soft. It's on the one hand kind of it has this romanticized vision of Canada that you've always challenged, that we're really basically good guys, and then there's these ugly Americans who we're fighting. Whereas Canada, we really have to do a critique of where Canada's been on all of this, a harsh critique, and not romanticize Canada. On the other hand, like, yeah, if we're going to take on this fight, there'll be people with all kinds of politics and perspectives. And yeah, the Council of Canadians would be welcomed in it, but there have to be voices that go beyond what the Council of Canadians are saying. There have to be socialists and people who are anti-imperialists. saying, look, Canada hasn't been so wonderful, and we have to come out of this with challenging Canada too. That's going to be part of this whole process. And, that's going to involve this, mediation between different groups and building something. I see it as not that we're on the verge of winning, but this is a moment where Trump can inadvertently act as a catalyst for starting for the left having an opening to build in a way that they haven't been able to build for a long time. And I guess that's what I see this moment as. And it's a test. We don't have the organizations to sustain it. There's no party that will sustain it. There's no strong union movement to sustain it. So it's a question of building, really taking advantage of this moment and getting people to think about what kind of a world they want, what kind of a Canada they want, what Canada has really been doing, see through, all the superficial stuff. And it's going to be a real fight. I mean, it's going to be an educational fight, an ideological fight. And it's exciting because there's actually an opening. But we can't get sucked into the inevitable traps of, pure nationalism, romanticizing Canada, feeling relief if we actually win against the Americans because they dropped the tariff. It's got to go beyond all of that.
Agreed. I think there's also probably a role for indigenous First Nations sort of anti-imperialist activists and leaders and vision. And I think that that's out there, but it's a matter of uh, catalyzing that.
Now,
Um,
I should say on that, Eve, we just have to be honest about the indigenous questions. I mean, when the indigenous movement was fighting the tar sands and linking it to the environment and linking it to dependence on the US, uh, they were really in a position to lead some crucial fights. But we also have to appreciate how divided the indigenous movement is. And, its own struggles for, well, there doesn't seem to be alternatives. So you kind of, you make compromises to get access to the oil and start talking about, soft pedaling questions that they're leading on before. And this just has to be recognized. But of course, yeah, we have to think about where the indigenous movement fits into this and how we, um, yeah, how do we deal with the divisions uh, in the indigenous movement? Because the strategy of the state has been to integrate leaders in the indigenous movement by giving them a piece of the action around resources. And yeah, so this is also a difficult question. We're facing a lot of difficult questions, but at least the difficult questions are coming up and forcing us to figure out how to deal with them.
Agreed. Thanks a lot for coming on Talking Foreign Policy. This is going to be something that obviously is going to be followed, and there's going to be lots of discussion, organizing that needs to go on in terms of delinking Canada from the U.S. empire and how Donald Trump maybe offers some opportunities on that front. Thanks a lot for coming on, Sam.
Good, thank you. And by the way, just